Hello everyone. Bit of a general chit chat today. Haven't done a ramble in a little while, and got a few things to discuss. Not mainly wargaming, but not entirely wargaming related. So I haven't done a mountain ramble in ages, and part of the reason for that is I'm feeling slightly kind of overwhelmed at the moment by the amount of projects that I've got on the go, and the amount of unpainted lead. Some of it I've got no prospect of ever completing in my late lifetime. I've just got so much to do, and at the moment excuse me, I'm being sort of pulled one way and another by all my various interests. I thought I'd start off with Cruel Seas, because that's something I have managed to paint a few bits and pieces for recently. But I have to admit, I really am cooling to Cruel Seas. I mean, as you probably know from my previous videos, I enjoyed the game. I played solo of it, and I like the idea and the general character of the game, but I'm getting very kind of disillusioned with the way Warlord have marketed it and promoted it. And on top of that, I haven't been able to get to the local wargaming club that I've told you about recently. I rely on a lift to it, and the friend who gives me a lift hasn't been, because it's on a Friday evening and it's every fortnight. Unfortunately, he's had other commitments for the last month and a half, and we're due to play a game of Cruel Seas, and I'm looking forward to that, but haven't got around to it yet. And as I say, I have managed to paint a few more bits and pieces. You're looking at an armed trawler, which is sort of fairly bog standard kind of vessel to play with. And I also finished the German minesweeper. Now this is where I like this model. I haven't painted it particularly well or anything. I do like it, but this is where I'm beginning to find, I'm wondering what direction Warlord are taking this game. If I show you an old finished model there, that's a Vosper. You can immediately see that, to my mind, the game revolved around vessels of this size, motor torpedo boats, Schnell boats for the Germans, and up to this kind of size. This kind of thing is just going to really dominate games. It's got two 3-inch guns amongst all its other armoury. One at the bow and one at the stern. Mines, obviously, depth charges. The game seems to be moving away from my kind of concept of it as a sort of aerial dogfight on water, if that makes sense. And it's dangerously close to being a very kind of simple, fast play naval combat rules, which is fine in its own right, except that you're talking about 1/300th scale, and even small 3-inch guns on a 6'4" table really going to dominate the table and the game. And it just seems like the Warlord are going more for the sort of visual appeal and the urge to kind of, that we war gamers have to collect models and boost our armory and so on. And particularly their website seems to be flooded now with trumpeter plastic kits for corvettes and small destroyers and other vessels. They're not the same scale. British Legion put up an interesting video a few weeks ago where he'd painted up this model, and he'd put it alongside a model of a corvette that he'd assembled, and the corvette was about that big in 1/350 scale. So whereas Warlord is saying that you won't notice the difference, the difference was noticeable. And on top of that, the kits are meant to be kits. They're meant to be modelers' kits. They're not meant to be wargaming models. They're not waterline. You have to cut the bottoms off of the hulls in order to make them into waterline models. And they're not as robust as wargaming models. You know, so things can snap off more easily. The masts and all the bits and pieces that you have to assemble. They're meant to be models that you put on display, not models that you play with. And I think to flood the website with so many of those models, it distracts from the main aim of the game. I think they have Warlord, to be fair, they have now just recently released, or they're about to release, I think, a 1/300 scale corvette, but then, you know, that's far more suitable to buy. But then again, you get back to this other point that a corvette is about as large as you really want to go with a game in 1/300 scale on a 6'x4" table. So there we are. So I've definitely got my reservations about this game now. Still looking forward to having a game or two of it down at the club, but I think I'm kind of reaching the limit of or the extent of how much I want to explore the game now. The one thing that I do want to get hold of, though, so I'm going to contradict myself now, but I noticed in a circular that Warlord sent recently that sometime this year they're going to produce or release a really nice model of a sort of wharf, a quayside, with some berthing spaces for the motor torpedo boats. On the illustration, the photo that they attached, there was a German Schnellboat, but it looked suitable for a dockyard piece for either the British or the German navies. It looked just sort of generically European, and it had nice little cranes and derricks and things like that, and I think there was a warehouse on it. So that got me thinking about, really, I mean I just wanted that because it was an attractive piece, but it got me thinking really about how on earth you could incorporate it into a game of Cruel Seas, because as a standalone item on the edge of the board, or even on a piece of coastline, it simply wouldn't look realistic. You're not going to have a kind of isolated wharfing facility for your motor torpedo boats without it being surrounded by other civilian buildings, a small port, or a naval dockyard of some kind. There's going to be all kinds of pillboxes on it, anti-aircraft defences, coastal defences, shore batteries, all that kind of thing. So the minute you incorporate that onto your table, you're gonna run into the same problem. The guns are going to be even larger than these. They're going to absolutely dominate the table. So how on earth are you going to use that original concept of playing combats with all these sort of small mortar torpedo boats and have them playing on a table where they can be obliterated by the coastal defences? So as I say, I'm kind of I want to get it, but I'm contradicting myself in that I'm finding it very hard to imagine how I'm going to be able to kind of include it in a game. But anyway, it did get me onto the subject of other buildings and other scenery that you might be able to include in a game of Cruel Seas. So out of my lead mountain, although it's not properly lead, it's actually resin, I remembered that way back in the 1980s I'd bought some 6mm buildings in resin whilst I was at Salute, which in this particular occasion was back in Kensington Town Hall, and I'd never painted them up. I can't for the life of me even. I think I've got them thinking they might be suitable for ACW, and I was thinking of wargaming the ACW in 6mm. Never got around to it, but I soon realised that these are more 20th century houses. They look more like blitzed city streets or something like that. So I got 3 of these. 2 of them are not the same, but they're similar. And you can put them together in a variety of ways so that the cobbled streets kind of match up and so on. So finally got these painted after, what's that, nearly 30 years. And there's a third one which is slightly different. It's got more of a kind of earth road type of appearance to it, but these buildings struck me as something that you might find adjacent to a naval base. It could be warehouses, repair sheds, that kind of thing. This one in the middle is more like a barn, but it doesn't strike me that this is a farm area, because the farmyard buildings tend to be more grouped together rather than spread out in a road system like this. So I thought that would be quite good to go beside this new birthing facility that I saw Warlord were about to bring out. So got that done anyway. Right, so that's as much as I've got to tell you about Cruel Seas. I've now gone back to, as you probably know as well, I've always got some Crimean War figures on the table, on the go, so I've gone back to trying to bash some more of those out. But again, that is a kind of overwhelming prospect, because I realise now it's taken me nearly 2 years. I think it was the beginning of 2017 I started the Crimean War project, and still haven't, I've nearly got there, but I still haven't completely finished the British Army, and I've only got a few Russian figures painted at the moment. So it's going to be another, at this rate, it's going to be another 2 years before I get anywhere close to playing a game. But I'm plodding along with that slowly. What else has been happening? I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a sort of modelling tip, but I think I'm going to do that a bit later. Non-wargaming, doing a lot of walking on the moor. Yesterday when I was out, I won't show it to you for reasons you might understand in a minute, but I found yet another GPS Garmin device just lying on the ground, and it was in a really out of the way spot. It wasn't on a path or anything like that. It was a really freak accident that I found it. But I've just phoned up Garmin headquarters in Southampton, and the owner hadn't registered it with them, so they have no way of returning it to the owner. So I'm going to hang on to it with the proviso that I have notified the Devon and Cornwall Police website, which has a kind of like lost and found property section on it. So I put the details of the device on there, just in case the owner does think of reporting it lost. But as I say, it was in such a remote spot and right off the beaten track that they've probably given up all hope of ever getting it back, but it's there. But that's why I don't want to show it to you, because I've described it in more detail on the police website. But yeah, it's actually, unlike the other one that I found, which was needed a lot of attention to get it to work again, because it had been underwater for quite a while. This one, I just turned it on straight away, or when I got home anyway, and could work out where the on off buttons were and so on. And it's got a lot of it's far more recent kind of model. It's got lots of interesting facilities and applications on it, so I'm probably going to start making use of that. So that was quite a neat find. I am now officially an old age pensioner, and I applied for my free bus pass, got that the other day. Dreadful photo on there, so I can now start making free bus journeys out into the surrounding area. It's a wargaming friend of mine is very bitter that he is slightly older than me. No, sorry, younger than me. He is very upset by the fact that a lot of his slightly younger friends all got their, slightly older friends all got their bus passes many years ago, because men are entitled to a bus pass when they reach the female state retirement age, and that used to be 60 years old, but the government has slowly been incrementally increasing that over the last sort of, 5 years or so. So I had to wait not only until I was 65, but in fact until I was 65 and a quarter, because the eventual aim is to get both the male and female state retirement age up to 70. So my wargaming friend is going to have to wait even longer again. So he's going to have to wait a good sort of 6 years longer than a lot of his older friends who got theirs when they were 60. And I'm not moaning that at all. I would have preferred to have got mine at the age of 60 5 years ago. But the big hidden kind of scandal of all this is not that they are raising the state pension age, and it's not that they are making the female and male age equivalent. I'm quite happy with both of those issues. The big problem is that the generation of women who are now having to wait until they're 65 and a quarter or 66 before they get their state pension were the generation that often stayed at home whilst their husbands worked, and they were encouraged to not to pay national insurance contributions, because in those days, back in the 60s and 70s, women were entitled to receive a state pension based on the national insurance contributions of their husbands. And of course all that has changed now, and women are obliged to pay national insurance and contributions in their own right. But it's left that generation with 20 years or more of unpaid national insurance contributions. So their state pensions, they not only have to wait longer for, but they are barely sufficient to survive on. On top of which, even though they're kind of not going to draw their pensions until they're 65 or higher, a lot of jobs and a lot of insurance policies and so on, all paid out on the anticipation that they were going to retire at 60. So they've got like a minimum of a 5-year gap when they might not even be getting any income or anything like that. And that's a sort of hidden crisis. It's actually quite serious. You know, there are women who are finding themselves in severe financial difficulties because maybe they're widowed or they're divorced and they're having to kind of finance themselves and possibly their offspring, all on benefits and so on, and it's caused a lot of problems. But anyway, I've got my bus pass now, so I'm going to be out and about exploring the area. So yeah, let's get on to this modelling tip as such that I wanted to talk about. Just been watching a video from Heresy Productions, Palmer, and he was talking about trying to source some decals for an infinity model that he's just painted up really nicely. And I've mentioned in the past, and you very rarely seem to come across people doing this, but it is possible to manufacture your own transfers. Now I do it using paper from a company called the Crafty Computer Paper. Their website, give it to you there, is www.craftycomputerpaper.co.uk, and I found it's worked really well for me, so I wanted to show you some examples of what I've done and give you a kind of brief idea of how you do it. Now there are two types of paper. You can either have the clear paper, which I tend to prefer, or there's this type, which is the white paper. Now you have to be aware of which you've got and what you're doing, because white paper simply prints the image onto white paper, and then you cut the image out and place it on the model or whatever that you want to use. But the white is going to show up, so if you're putting it onto, say, a dark background, you're going to have to cut really close to the design, otherwise you're going to get a white border, and the white, anything white on the image will show up white without a problem. The problem is you're going to have, if you've got a very intricate shape or something like that, you're going to have to cut very close to it and then possibly paint over the white border to conceal it. A preferable way, what I prefer to do anyway, is to use clear paper. Now with the clear paper, you have to apply that to a white background. So whatever you do, don't design the transfer, print it out, paint your model, and then apply the transfer, because it will show the background color through the transfer because it's on clear paper. So that means it will kind of hide any dark colors, any or even any bright colors like yellow. The color of the background will show through the color of the print and change the color, hide it, subdue it, and so on. I'll show you what I mean about that in a moment. Now I used to be able to design my own transfers by hand, and it's probably still technically possible. I had this pad which plugs in through a USB port to your computer, and you literally, this is like rather than a mouse, it's a pen, but it works in exactly the same way as a mouse would. So you can freehand drawings and so on onto this surface, which is the equivalent of a mouse pad, and the image will show up on your screen. You do need to have some graphics software though, so this one does come with its own software. Unfortunately, this is the platforms, is it called the platform, has been superseded now. So I've got Windows 10 and this is compatible with old platforms. Oh, is it platforms? Never know what I'm talking about when I'm describing computers, but systems, old systems, yeah. So this is only compatible with things like ME, XP, Vista and so on. It wouldn't cope with Windows 8 or Windows 10, which I've got. But possibly I'll be able to find some way of getting some software that will work with this nowadays. But the other software that I used to use was Serif. This one here, desktop publishing. Let's open this out a little bit. Desktop publishing suite, and again, this is not compatible with more modern systems, and I can't find anything, or not cheaply anyway, equivalent to this now. Serif they seem to have been amalgamated into another company. They don't seem to exist in their own right now, and all the graphics software that I can find is really prohibitively expensive now. Windows do their own kind of version of it, so you could use Windows stuff, I suppose, but it's a lot harder to actually design your own transfers now. But what you can do is you can grab plenty of images off of the net, and I tend to use Photoshop now, incorporate images and clip art that I've grabbed from the web, and print those out from Photoshop and onto decal paper and do it that way. So to give you an example of some things that I've done, yeah, before I go on, I should say what you have to do is print it out onto the paper. I would definitely recommend that you allow the ink to dry thoroughly, and then you have to coat it with a varnish. Otherwise, when you put the decal paper into water to lift the transfer off, the ink will run. But at the same time, if you haven't allowed the original printing ink to dry and then you spray varnish on it, the varnish itself can sometimes cause the ink to run before you even get going. So let it dry, varnish it thoroughly so that it's got a watertight seal on it, and then you can cut it out and apply it. So some time ago I made up my own version of Saga for the Wars of the Roses period, and I grabbed some appropriate symbols. Those of you who play Saga will know what I'm on about now, but in order to play Saga you need Saga dice, which are basically faction specific dice. So I printed out from general clip art that's free to use on the web. You can grab it and apply it to anything you want. I printed out some images that I thought suited the Wars of the Roses. So I've got a crown, a rose, and a medieval looking kind of helmet. And these are all on clear paper. And what I did, as you can see, I purchased some blank white dice. Now, black print on white, there's not going to be a problem with it whatsoever. And I think you can see they have really sort of stuck down really nicely. You can barely see that there's a transfer attached to that. That's not always the case. Sometimes you find it's quite hard to level it with, and because this is a nice flat surface that's happened. It's not as easy to do that if you're putting it onto a flag or onto the caparison of a horse or something in the medieval period. But for dice it works really well. Black on white, no problem with the paper being clear. Same applies if you print black of any kind and put it onto another colour such as red. So here you can see I've got these would obviously be white for York and red for Lancaster, and the black doesn't cause a problem at all. But had I made the crowns well, certainly had I made them red, they would have disappeared on that. They would show up on this one. So here's an example of that. So here's some dice where the image is printed in red and it shows up perfectly well on white. If I'd put that on the red, you wouldn't have been able to see the crown. And other colours like greens and yellows and so on, the red would certainly show through and spoil the colour. So that's one example of how you can get a little bit creative with your own transfers and so on. I won't go into the details of the game. It was very popular down at my local club, and I'm hoping they did promise, Studio Tomahawk did promise that they are going to release a sort of medieval version of Saga sometime in the future, obviously based on version 2 of the rules, so my adaptation won't be usable any longer, but keeping my eye open for that. So I've got all the figures and so on. You can apply these transfers to figures. So here is another example. These are some 15mm Peter Pig. Let's zoom in again a little bit. 15mm Peter Pig figures. And what I've used transfers for in this case is just to create a mon. So again, this is another image. I think maybe I designed that because it's quite easy to design. Sorry, it's not focusing very well. It's quite easy to design straight lines, but it was much easier than painting every single figure. Just print dozens of them off and paste them down onto a white background. So I've got about 20 odd of these figures. One thing that I did find in this case is that these little transfers can lift off quite easily, so you have to make sure that they have adhered to the surface and then varnish them quite heavily and make sure they haven't lifted off either. I think in most cases, I mean, there are a few folds in the sashimono that might cause them to lift, because the paper is a little bit less pliant than commercially printed designs. It's quite thick paper, and it does tend to kind of lift up a little bit on raised surfaces. So in this case, this is a zombie. Forget what they call them now. I think they're called, without trying to be sizist or anything, I think they're called fatties, I'm not sure. But these are the larger zombies from Zombicide. And in this case, because my focusing on this camera is not being terribly helpful today, you might not be able to see it, but I actually grabbed a design for a tattoo, which would be impossible, absolutely impossible for me to hand paint in 28 or 30mm, and put that down on his one of his biceps, and then I've got another one, a coloured one, on his other bicep there. Wish I could. Don't think it's going to focus. No, it doesn't look like it. But that worked really well, except that if you do look at it very closely, you can see that the one on this side is slightly raised from the figure. But another example about how really sort of minute, intricate patterns, just print them off on a very high resolution printer onto transfer paper and then transfer them to your figure. So that's transfers anyway, that's nearly at the end. Just thought I'd show you another thing that I'm thinking of doing with my channel. This is a long way off. Going back to this thing, getting my state pension soon, so I'm going to have a little bit of money to play with, additional money to play with soon. And I was thinking of saving up to buy a microscope, because I read, well, it's hardly reading, this book is nearly all pictures, but I got hold of this recently. It's a book by John Larson called In Search of Stardust, And basically there's a thing called the Urban Micrometeorite Project. Now there are micrometeorites falling on the surface of the planet all the time. I forget the exact figure, but every square metre, I think, has one micrometeorite fall onto it. Oh no, it's either a day or a year, I can't remember the exact figure. But they're constantly falling out of the sky. They're either kind of cosmic dust that has fallen through the atmosphere, or they are the product of larger meteorites burning up in the atmosphere as they fall, and then all the kind of ablated material burning off it and falling as kind of a sooty sort of deposit. The meteorite that was so spectacularly caught landing in Russia, it's nearly 10 years ago now, I think, that was captured on all those car cameras and so on, that nearly all burnt off and left a huge trail of kind of black dust on the snow, which was millimeter sized particles of extraterrestrial material. But this guy John Larson, what he's done is proved that it is possible to find them not only in these pristine areas such as Antarctica and so on, where there is no man-made material to kind of in which they hide, but you can actually find them in towns and cities as well. Much harder to do because the massively large amount of it is man-made material, such as from construction, from grinding, from roadworks, tarmac type materials, gravelly type particles, even things like fireworks and so on. They all leave very kind of typical kind of small particles that you can identify under a microscope. But it is possible to eliminate them, because for one thing they will be the massively preponderant amount in the material that you're sampling, but also there are characteristic appearances to these micrometeorites that man-made material doesn't share. But it struck me that it would be an interesting thing to do anyway, is to kind of occasionally sweep my patio. I mean, places that you typically find them are in where gutters release their material from the roof onto the ground and so on. These materials are all man-made. They're all what they call anthropogenic, mineral walls, all this kind of thing. But this is the other thing, that if you can use this as a reference to eliminate particles you find. These are fireworks. They tend to be highly colourful because of the chemicals that are used. So I thought I might give that a go and start to kind of image things, image the sort of microparticle world, and show images on my YouTube channel. I mean, to get a decent microscope, there's probably several £1,000s. You can get quite cheap microscopes that are powered through the USB port of your laptop or computer, but the resolution on those and the magnification is very poor. They're really kind of for schoolboys and girls. So I think I'm going to wait and shell out on quite an expensive one, and then most of the modern microscopes now, you can capture images and download them to your computer. And it struck me that it's another way of imaging Dartmoor, because there's loads of obviously not micrometeorites, stardust on Dartmoor. I'm sure there is, but there's been so much industry up there, mining of aluminium and nickel and all those kind of things, as well as all the coal dust and the train lines and so on that's going to be up there. There's going to be lots of carbon, and there's also going to be lots of natural kind of you know, sort of bring back moss and so on, and show all the little creatures that are kind of crawling around in lichen and pond water and so on. So I thought I might start sort of incorporating images of that into my Dartmoor videos, because I quite like picking up little bits of stone and so on and bringing those back and just keeping them on my mantelpiece. So anyway, that's don't hold your breath, because it's going to take me a little while to save up the money for it, but I think I'll get a microscope. But there's another few. I want to take a few holidays and things like that, and start to kind of replenish my threadbare wardrobe, clothing, and all that kind of thing as well. Have a few days out here and there, but this is going to be something that I'm going to aim for. I think that is everything I wanted to talk about. So thanks for listening. I'll see you on the next video. Bye for now.